Hey guys, welcome back to the 10th episode of my poker vlog. This session takes place at the Lodge in Round Rock, Texas on a Saturday afternoon. I buy in for $200 and sit down at a 1-2 no limit hold'em table. Let's take a look at what happens. My first hand, I've got King 10 suited in clubs, and I'm sitting in the small blind. I've got about $150 in front of me. It folds to the hijack, who's been raising a fair number of hands, and he raises to $16. The cutoff calls, and I decide to call here and take a flop. So we see 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 4-10-5 rainbow. I flop top pair second kicker. I consider leading out here, but I don't want to bloat the pot out of position, so I decide to take a more passive route. I check to the hijack, who bets out for $35. The cutoff folds, and I make the call. So we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the ace of spades. I'm not a fan of this card since it's more likely to be in my opponent's range than mine. However, when I check to him, he checks behind, giving us a free river. The river comes the 8 of diamonds. It's essentially a blank, and I'm hoping my pair of 10s is good. I check for a third time, and fortunately my opponent checks behind. Given his passiveness on the river, I quickly announce my hand, and it turns out to be the winner as he mucks pocket 7s. So I scoop a $120 pot.
Appreciate it. Thanks.
The next interesting hand I've got is pocket queens, and I'm sitting in middle position with about $200. The player to my right limps, and I raise to $15. The button calls and the limper calls, so we've got 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 10-8 ace rainbow. The limper checks to me, and I continuation bet for $17. Both players make the call, which I'm not happy about given the ace on the board. The turn brings the 9 of hearts. This card is interesting since it could bring in some gut shot straight opportunities, or 2 pair for anyone with a hand like 10-9 or 9-8. The limper checks to me again, and I opt to check this time. When the button checks as well, I'm really only worried about the limper's hand at this point, as I imagine the button would have bet any hand that's beating mine. The river brings the 3 of diamonds. This card doesn't change anything, it's essentially a blank. The limper now bets into me for $45. It's a scary bet, and normally I would turbo muck my hand at this point. However, I've recognized that this is a spot that I should give more thought to. As the gears are going in my head, I start thinking there are some 9x holdings that would have flopped to straight draw and only improve to a single pair on the turn. Given the way the action played out across all the streets, I'm feeling pretty confident about the idea that I could be ahead of this player, and I end up making the call. The button folds, and my opponent shows 9-6 suited for a flopped gut shot that hit the 9 on the turn, exactly as I thought. I'm really happy about my decision to slow down and think about this one instead of just folding. I scooped the $189 pot. For this next hand, I've got Jack 10 suited in hearts, and I'm sitting in the cutoff. There's a player to my right who joined the table in the last 20 or 30 minutes who's been pretty aggressive in terms of raising a large number of hands and getting involved in pots. I happen to be pretty card dead for this period and have seen virtually no flops. He raises to $16 following another player who limped in, and I call behind. As soon as I call his raise, he says,
"Oh, you call me?" I'm not sorry.
Yeah, he's worried about me calling. So this gives me a little bit of information that this player thinks I'm playing like a nit, and probably that I'm just playing premium hands here. The big blind calls, and the limper calls as well, so we see 4 players to the flop. The flop comes 8 ace king with 2 hearts. I flop a flush draw and a gut shot to Broadway. It checks to the guy on my right, who bets $2. I'm essentially treating this as a check, and given the combination of my nit image as well as my draws, I decide this is a chance to play strongly. I raise to $36. It folds back to the player who bet $2, who reluctantly makes the call, saying,
See one toss.
And we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the 4 of spades. The turn doesn't help, but I have no reason to let up on the pressure given my assessment of the scenario. When my opponent checks to me, I bet again for $55. My opponent folds before I can even get the chips out, and I pick up the pot.
Thank you.
Just a few hands later, I'm dealt ace 10 suited in diamonds, and I'm sitting under the gun. I raise to $12. The cutoff calls, the small blind calls, and the player on my right calls. So we see 4 players to the flop. The flop comes ace jack queen with 2 hearts, so I flop top pair with a gut shot on a coordinated board. It checks to me, and the dealer doesn't recognize I have cards, skipping my action at first, and the player behind me is about to check. I grab the dealer's attention to let him know I haven't acted. I would have c-bet here regardless of the player behind me checking, but I now feel even more comfortable making a bet. I make it $23. It folds back to the player on my right, who asks if I want to call.
You want me to call you?
I'm gonna leave it up to you. I'll let your hand play itself.
He makes the call, and we go heads up to the turn. When my opponent checks to me again, I'm probably still ahead here, but I imagine he probably has some sort of draw or worse pair. Given that, I'm not worried about too many river cards, and I don't want to bloat the pot with just top pair on such a coordinated board, so I opt to check behind. On the river, we see the 5 of spades. My opponent checks to me again, and I consider making a value bet here. However, given that he's shown himself to be an aggressive player at times, I don't want to end up in a spot where I'm check raised off my hand that's good enough to go to showdown, so I opt just to check behind here. I show my hand, and my opponent shows that he had the king of hearts for the missed flush and straight draws. I pick up a small pot, but I wanted to show this hand because I think it plays more into the image of my being a nit against this player for an upcoming hand. The next interesting hand I've got, I'm dealt ace-5 offsuit. I'm sitting in the big blind. There's 4 limpers into the pot, and the small blind, the player to my right, raises to $12. The raiser is an aggressive player, and I can't imagine him raising for such a small amount with a better hand here. It looks more like he's trying to sweeten the pot, so to speak. Given all the limps preceding his raise, this feels like a good opportunity to 3-bet and isolate or just pick up the pot altogether. I re-raised to $37. It folds back to the button, who ends up pushing all in for $73 total. His play doesn't make sense to me for a big hand given that he limped behind on the button, and I imagine he has a small to medium pocket pair at best. This scenario is reminiscent of the ace-8 hand I played in the 3rd episode of my poker vlog. The player to my right folds, and I make the call here. My opponent shows king-queen offsuit, so my read wasn't far off. We see an ace in the door when the flop comes 7-3 ace with 2 diamonds. The turn brings the 3 of spades, and my opponent's drawing dead now, and we see an inconsequential 8 of hearts on the river. I scoop the $164 pot.
You are.
Thank you.
This next hand is the one you've been waiting for. I'm dealt 9-8 suited in clubs, and I'm sitting in small blind. The hijack limps in, the player to my right from earlier raises to $16 on the button. I call in the small blind. Interestingly, I didn't hear it live at the table, but I noticed while producing this vlog that the player to my right says,
I got 8-9, that's why I changed.
did he really just call my exact hand? The hijack calls as well. There's 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 4 king-queen with 2 clubs. I flop a flush draw, but there are 2 overcards to my hand, and I don't have anything else to go with my draw. It checks to the player on my right, who bets $27. I'm getting about 3-1 on a call, and even though I'm not quite getting the direct odds to make a call here, I decide to since we're both deep stack at this point. The 3rd player folds, so we're heads up to the turn. The turn brings the king of spades. This is not the turn card I wanted to see, and with that, I check to my opponent. He ends up betting $65 almost immediately. In previous hands, I've noticed that when this player has a strong hand and is worried about draws, he's been inclined to bet very large relative to the pot. I think it's hard to assume my opponent has a king here given how he's played so aggressively and the number of hands he's played. Given how I've played the hand so far, it's very possible for me to have a king in this spot, and I'm also thinking about the fact that he made that comment earlier that leads me to believe that he thinks I'm playing pretty nitty. With all that, along with the equity I've got with my flush draw, I end up making a semi-bluff here. I come over the top for $100 more, for $165 total. My opponent thinks for a long time. 2 whole minutes pass while he thinks about what he's going to do. He counts out his chips, moves them in front of him to count as though he's contemplating a shove, and I'm sitting here sweating in my mind the whole time. However, I happen to have a very calm demeanor this particular day, and so I'm only sweating on the inside. Finally, after making me sweat for so long, he throws his cards into the muck, and my play worked, so I scooped the pot.
Thank you.
You are welcome.
Appreciate it.
The last interesting hand of note, I'm dealt ace-9 suited in spades, and I'm sitting in the cutoff. There's 2 limpers into the pot, and I raised to $12 in the cutoff. The under-the-gun player calls, and the aggressive player to my right calls as well, so we see 3 players to the flop. The flop comes 4 queen 8 with 2 spades. I flop the nut flush draw with 1 overcard. It checks to me, and I bet $20. The under-the-gun player folds, and the player to my right calls. The turn brings the 4 of diamonds. It does not improve my hand, and given that this is my 4th big encounter with the aggressive player to my right, where I've won the previous 3, this feels like a good spot to take a free card. When he checks to me, I check back to see what the river brings. The river brings the 6 of clubs. Unfortunately, I miss my flush, and I'm expecting to be behind at this point. My opponent leads into me for $30. I fold and show my hand to give the impression that I'm still playing relatively strong hands, even if I'm not.
Nice hand.
So I just finished a 3.5 hour session at the lodge. I started with 200 and cashed out for 804. So it was $604 winnings minus $35 and tip costs for the hourly rate. So very happy with the result. Proud of the call that I made on the queen's hand. I almost folded that one early, but after thinking about it, I thought there was a good chance that I was getting in bet at by somebody who had a straight draw with a 9 and hit the 9, and it turned out that was right. So happy about that one, and made a scary bluff that worked out against an aggressive player. You know, he had shown that the way he behaved led me to believe that he thought I was a bit of a nit the way I was playing, and tried to take advantage of that a little bit, and it ended up working out, even though I was sweating it quite a bit. Overall, really happy with the results. Look forward to coming back again. Please hit the like and subscribe button. Until then, I'll see you on the next one. Take care. Thanks.